Well, I was living in New York City when Bob Fosse's All That Jazz premiered in late 1979. I saw it before most of the reviews had come out and before most of the audience knew what the heck to expect. When the film's open heart surgery became graphic, with a beating heart exposed, half of the audience immediately walked out. And I never saw people walk out of a movie in New York, but Janet Maslin's review in the New York Times offered one reason why. People don't go to the movies to watch open heart surgery, she wrote. A miscalculation this violent becomes unforgivable. One of you has suggested that if All That Jazz were released today, probably few would be shocked by this fearless, mesmerizing, intense, fantastical movie. But it's a musical, for heaven's sake, and as such, it breaks all the rules. It's a semi-autobiographical tale of the famous director-choreographer Bob Fosse, and it's been labeled The Big Finish. With Roy Scheider starring as Fosse's alter ego, Joe Gideon, All That Jazz can still astonish all these years later. The character of Angelique, played by Jessica Lange, asks Joe, "What about work?" He replies, "All there is." And he could have added another word, because this movie is about work and death, which Fosse considered the only reality. Get this. One of his biographers, Martin Gottfried, writes that All That Jazz has an intensely personal stamp that is unlike any director except Orson Welles and Charlie Chaplin. Mind you, Fosse made only 5 films. All That Jazz was the 4th. In case you need a bit more context, he was born in Chicago in 1927 and began performing at the age of 9. Fast forward to 1953 and his year at MGM, which included a featured role opposite Debbie Reynolds in Stanley Donen's Give a Girl a Break. He envisioned himself as the next Gene Kelly. And Donen praised him years later as a 137-pound dancer who was elegant, miniature, quirky, detailed, delicate, and an expert at small dancing, all qualities that later would be admired in his choreography. But Fosse left Hollywood for Broadway, making his debut as a Broadway choreographer with The Pajama Game and stopping the show with Steam Heat. From that moment on, there was no stopping him. In his next Broadway show, Damn Yankees, he choreographed star Gwen Verdon, who became his wife and also his muse. Bob Fosse belonged to an exclusive, unofficial club with just 5 members, all of them major choreographers and directors. The other 4 were Jerome Robbins, Michael Kidd, Gower Champion, and, by the early 1970s, Michael Bennett. What they shared was an obsession with controlling every moment, every word, every note, every square inch of their musicals. Not that there's anything wrong with that. All of them were visionaries. But Fosse was the only one who triumphed on both stage and screen. In the 1970s alone, his Broadway work comprised Pippin, Chicago, and Dancin'. The films he directed during that decade, in addition to All That Jazz, were Cabaret, the non-musical Lenny, the TV special Liza with a Z, as in Liza Minnelli, and as a performer, The Little Prince. All That Jazz was inspired by Fellini's 8½, about the brilliant film director's life and work. By the way, Fellini's cinematographer Giuseppe Rotunno took on All That Jazz. Another inspiration was a book by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross titled on Death and Dying, which explores what she called the 5 stages of death. All That Jazz is centered in 1974 when Fosse suffered a heart attack while being addicted, as usual, to amphetamines, alcohol, cigarettes, pot, and countless women who were attracted to him like moths to a flame, despite his inability to be faithful to any of them, including Gwen Verdon. He was married 3 times. And 1974 was a year in which, as usual, he was consumed with work. How close to Fosse's own life is Joe Gideon? Well, here's what Martin Gottfried has to say. It was merely about a prominent Broadway choreographer director who has a heart attack and bypass surgery in the midst of editing a new movie, The Stand-Up, starring Cliff Gorman as comedian Lenny Bruce, while simultaneously directing a new musical, NYLA, which in real life was Kander and Ebb's Chicago, starring his former wife, who was a famous dancer, Gwen Verdon, of course. Otherwise, it had nothing to do with Bob Fosse. End quote. For good measure, it also includes his girlfriend, Katie, Anne Reinking essentially playing herself. And there is Joe Gideon's daughter, Michelle, based on Fosse and Verdon's daughter, Nicole. The movie, which began shooting in 1978, 4 years after the heart attack, is honest, brutally so, and cynical, with the producers of the Joe Gideon musical NYLA discovering that Joe could be worth more to them dead than alive. Fosse even co-wrote the screenplay with Robert Allen Arthur, and in the interest of truth-telling, they interviewed 100 people who knew and or worked with Fosse during this period. Pieces of the interviews made it into the film as dialogue. Vincent Canby in the Times summed it up this way: not even Fellini, Ingmar Bergman, or Woody Allen, all of whom are similarly guilt-ridden, has ever celebrated himself quite so cruelly. I am amazed this film got made, and I'm not the only one. Daniel Melnick, the executive producer, pointed out, you have a hero who is self-indulgent, who is a bastard. He dies at the end. This is the unglamorous side of show business, and any of these could have killed us at the box office. We had all 4, and the budget ballooned from $6 million to almost 10. End quote. Yes, a bastard. Cy Coleman, Fosse's composer for Sweet Charity, said he could go from sweet to Hitler in 5 seconds. When Katie, the Anne Reinking character, tells Joe, I wish you weren't so generous with your cock, he pauses to reflect, then replies, that's good. I could use that. It should be noted that at one point Fosse wanted to play Joe Gideon himself. Richard Dreyfuss wound up with the role, though he backed out at the last minute, saying he needed to work in a warm and caring environment. Roy Scheider turned out to be perfectly cast and received an Oscar nomination, and though it wasn't in Fosse's nature to create warm, caring environments per se, he could be a witty, ironic, self-deprecating, and charming bastard. My life, said Fosse, is an open pamphlet. The film mostly moves at a breakneck pace thanks to Fosse's terrific editing and his use of lots of intercutting and rapid changes from scene to scene. As he explained, my own inner rhythm is a fast one, a musical rhythm that's bright, not lyrical. And so the film is what one critic accurately termed a rhythmic collage that makes the most of sound. Unsurprisingly, as Cy Coleman said, Fosse didn't like ballads. And All That Jazz doesn't really have any, at least none that aren't used ironically. The score uses Vivaldi to comment on Gideon's mantra after his morning ablutions. It's showtime, folks. There's vintage vaudeville and show music, and then current pop and rock that includes existing recordings by the likes of George Benson in the exciting opening number. There's no songwriting team. By then, Fosse had lost interest in collaborating, more of his need for control. The songs and dance numbers are performed in what might be called a Brechtian way. Instead of involving us emotionally, as in most musicals do, they keep us at a distance. Some of the dances, such as Erotica, display Fosse's signature preoccupation with sex. It's been named the Airplane Orgy Ballet. Perhaps his ultimate need for control in this film is that Joe Gideon directs his own death. And then there are what designer Tony Walton called the levels of Fosse's filmmaking: hallucinatory, fantasy, memory, naturalism, documentary. We're constantly caught off guard. Or as orchestrator Ralph Burns added, there's flashbacks, flash forwards, real time, and then there's Fosse time. If you believe as I do that God is in the details, this is your kind of movie. For example, the address on Joe's prescription for Dexedrine was Bob Fosse's address. And the set model that Joe demonstrates to the company of NYLA, which is to say Chicago, was the real set model designed by Tony Walton for Fosse's Broadway musical. There's so much insider stuff, a lot of it revealed in Kevin Winkler's excellent 2018 biography, but I'll spare you. Well, at the risk of too much personal information, I want to suggest that anyone who has been through therapy, including yours truly, can't help but be drawn to this film. In 2 hours, Bob Fosse lays out what we did or do every week. Interestingly, Fosse's psychiatrist was one of the people interviewed, and he said, "You cut yourself off from letting yourself be loved. You let yourself be adored, but not loved." And though Fosse won the Triple Crown of Tony, Oscar, and Emmy in 1973, he never got over a profound feeling of self-doubt. "One of these days," he said, "they're going to find me out." So, as one of the songs in Chicago puts it, he filled his shows with razzle-dazzle. And this tells us a lot, I think. He said, "I hesitate about a movement and think, oh no, they'll never buy that. It's too corny, too showbiz. And then I do it, and they love it." He had what became known as a weakness for the slick, which gave him a love-hate relationship with show business. So he swung from off-the-charts egotism to, as one of his friends on the interview tape said, a dreadful fear that you're ordinary. And that led to a fear that he was a fraud. But it didn't keep him from craving to be on the wire, as Joe says at the very beginning of the film. The rest, he adds, is waiting. We know he means waiting for death. When All That Jazz was released in 1979, Bob Fosse declared, "The only salvation for me is work. Only then do I experience absolute happiness." And what about the relentless perfectionism? How Fosse said at rehearsals over and over again, "Uno más," one more time. Therapists often try to discourage that, but it can be good. there can be something good about it. For instance, in All That Jazz, after Joe has spent months editing the stand-up and going way over budget, one of the executives admits to another, "It's better." Exactly. Producer Daniel Melnick maintained that if they had let Fosse do it, All That Jazz might have been edited down to 20 minutes. Said Melnick, Fosse was terrified of boring people. So, 10 times as much footage was shot than actually used. Steven Spielberg, who was Steven Spielberg even then, asked Roy Scheider, "He's not going to release the film with that ending, surely?" When Scheider said yes, he was, Spielberg said, "Boy, is he some movie maker." And director Stanley Kubrick, he of 2001, A Space Odyssey and A Clockwork Orange fame, called it the best film I think I have ever seen. All That Jazz has been tagged the Götterdämmerung of musicals. So I can't blame you if you ask, well, does Joe Gideon have any heart at all? The fact is, he does. In his love for the dancers who work for him, like Victoria Porter, he sleeps with her, but he also mentors her. And in his tender relationship with daughter Michelle, and in the scene in the hospital near the end of the film when he comforts an old woman who's near death, tells her she's beautiful, and tells her he loves her. It's the only time we hear him use that phrase. Of course, it's probably an hallucination, but if so, it's a heartfelt one. As you may know, All That Jazz predicted Bob Fosse's own death 8 years later, in 1987, of a massive coronary. He was just 60, working on a touring revival of Sweet Charity in Washington, D.C. Gwen Verdon, ever his muse, was at his side. A friend later remarked, Bob always had a death wish, and this was the way he wanted to go in the midst of a show. Here is what he said in Adding Up All That Jazz, which some consider to be his masterwork in cinema. I consider myself a showman, and I've tried to make a good show about an offbeat subject. Whether you like it or don't like it, it is not a copy of anything. I think it's the best thing I've ever done. And then, typical Fosse, he added, but I don't know how good it is. We do. I'm Bill Rudman from the Musical Theater Project.